Welcome back to Red Cedar Radar. I have a very special guest, as every week I say that. Paul Fanson is back on the pod again. It's been a little while, a couple
Few
months
weeks.
maybe since you've been on. He's a recent attendee at Big Ten Media Days, and he's been putting out some great articles recently, kind of gearing up for MSU's football season. How are you, Paul?
I'm doing really well. As we record this, it's Friday afternoon. It's always good to get to Friday. And I did drive down to Indianapolis and back over a 24-hour period, so it's been a busy week, but it's been a good one. So I'm, as always, happy to be back. It's always great to talk to you, Sydney.
I'm super excited to hear about Big Ten Media Days. I'm jealous that you got to go. Um, let's just dive right in. Any overall points about Big Ten Media Days that you want to talk about? Any kind of notable moments or, things that you want to touch on right off the bat? I have some specific questions, but kind of an
hmm
overview maybe.
Well, I think that there were several kind of key points, and we'll dive into some of these in detail. But I think from a Michigan State perspective, there was a lot of discussion about this, being a bounce back year, and a lot of comparisons to the 2021 season, where MSU coming off a very poor 2020 season, and then of course had a very successful 2021 season. And so there was a lot of comments that harkened back to that mindset of being, hungry and having a chip on their shoulder, and so we'll kind of see how that plays out in the season, but they're definitely approaching the season from a position of, yeah, we underachieved last year. Maybe there was some sense of complacency, but we've fixed those mistakes and we're going to be moving forward as a team. So that was kind of the overarching method or message from the Michigan State coaches and players. But from Big Ten Media Days overall, the situation at Northwestern, I think, was kind of a cloud that sort of hung over the entire event. It was during the morning session, and the way it's set up in the morning session, it's televised, and each coach gets about 15 minutes, and basically every single coach was asked about the Northwestern situation, including Coach Tucker. And then when the Northwestern coach came up, I mean, he looks like I don't know how old he is. He looks like a young guy. I mean, he kind of got thrown into the fire, and he basically gave kind of a filibuster. Like most of the coaches would give an opening 5 minute statement and allow the rest of the time for questions. He essentially read a prepared statement for maybe 12 minutes and just
Mm.
gave like a handful of minutes for questions. But then the way the event is set up is that in the afternoon, and this is not televised, the coaches will have a 45-minute time block where they sit at an 8-foot table behind a screen, and they're surrounded by media and just peppered with questions for 45 minutes. And during the session where the Northwestern coach, when it was his time, he was surrounded by, I mean, dozens of TV cameras and more media than I've ever seen at that event. I mean, Ryan Day was going at the same time, and he usually draws a big crowd, and there was at least 50% more people at the Northwestern table. And I didn't sit and listen to that, but it was pretty intense. And I mean, that was, I think, on Sports Center later when Ryan and Brad and I went out to dinner right by the stadium afterwards, and they were showing highlights from his some of the interviews at the media day. So that kind of overshadowed everything, but it did lead to some other good discussions that we'll talk about here in a minute, I think.
Yeah, and is it true? I read this on Twitter. Is it true that Northwestern did not have any players there?
That's true. I believe that was announced either the day before or the day of, but yeah, the players decided
That's what
that
I thought.
they weren't going to attend. And frankly, I don't blame them. I think that one of
Yeah.
the things that I've learned having, been on this staff for a while and having the chance to actually talk to the players, you do gain a different point of view and a different perspective that, yeah, these are college kids. And when you
Right.
meet them and you actually talk to them, and I mean, like I'm in my mid 40s. I'm old enough that I potentially could be some of these kids' parent, and like that changes your point of view. It really does. And so, like, yeah, I don't think those kids should be exposed to that. They're not being paid. It's they can this is a tough situation. They don't need to be under the microscopes. That's totally okay with me.
Yeah, I agree completely. That was going to be my next question. What were your thoughts on that? So we agree. Perfect. You touched on it briefly, kind of how all the coaches got asked about the Northwestern situation. Talk to me about what Coach Tucker's response to that question was.
Yeah. I mean, he addressed it pretty directly. I mean, his statement right off the bat was that, at MSU, we have a very strict anti hazing policy, and that this is something that they've addressed with the team, and that it's something that him and athletic director Alan Haller have discussed directly. So, I mean, it was very clear that, like, yes, we're aware this is something that we've addressed. But then what Coach Tucker did is he kind of pivoted that discussion to make it more about kind of building team chemistry, which was one of the key points that we heard from Tucker as well as some of the players throughout the afternoon. They mentioned that there was just been a lot of activities in this off season where they've really focused on trying to get to know each other better, outside of football. It sounds like they had more planned events than they ever had in the past. Coach Tucker mentioned, I think, a dodgeball tournament and a kickball tournament, going to movies. There was a little bit of a discussion with the players. I sat at the table with JD Duplain in the afternoon session, and he was bragging that his team had won the putt putt tournament, and so he was all excited. And there was clearly a little mild trash talking between him and Trey Mosley, who seemed to be one of the other captains of these teams. Ryan had the chance to interview Trey, and Trey was saying that he almost won the Triple Crown. I believe he had won his team had won the trivia competition and the I think it was bowling competition, whereas JD got him in golf. So they were clearly having some fun with that, and it was nice to see. And then there was a kind of a fun thread about movies where it actually started with Coach Brett Bielema from Illinois. Was asked during the morning session if he had taken his daughters to see the Barbie movie. And he's like,
Yeah.
no, they're more into mermaids these days. So no, I haven't seen that. And so we asked the players if they'd seen Barbie or Oppenheimer, and they said no. But JD said that the offensive lineman had gone to see Insidious 3. So I suppose
Ooh.
that for the big uglies on the lines, maybe a horror movie's better. I don't know. But so that was your Big Ten Media Days movie reviews for the week.
I feel like, and I don't know if this is true, obviously, but I feel like chemistry was lacking last season. Obviously, when things are going or things are rough, it's going to seem like chemistry is off just because of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I feel like that's a step in the right direction, maybe. And I like that they took that into consideration, and kind of looked at things big picture and not just like what's on the field. So I like that.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, moving into your next point. Also, I do want to say Paul wrote an article about his time at Big Ten Media Days and kind of gave some points that will be listed in the description of the episode for people to check out. So I'm kind of just going off the points that he listed and letting him kind of explain his, um, points from then on. So talking about last year, as I did, tell me what Coach Tucker had to say about kind of what they've learned from last year and how they're applying it to this upcoming season.
Yeah, that was a statement that he made in his opening remarks, that they had, the coaching staff had learned a lot and reflected from the results of the last year. And when we actually, I think it was Chris Solari asked a follow up question about that. Well, like, what do you actually mean? And he essentially pivoted towards the injury situation, and that was
Mm,
a big part of the conversation, both again with Tucker later and with the players, is that they acknowledged that they really did have a lot of trouble with injuries last year. And I mean, I think we saw that clearly, especially on the defensive side of the ball, where we had, you could argue that the most talented player at all three levels, whether it
we're
be
out.
Slade and Snow and
Mm-hmm.
Henderson, were out for significant
Mm-hmm.
amounts of time. And, I tend to believe that injuries are underrated at the college level as far as their overall impact. Because I mean, it's not like an NFL roster where you can just, you've got,
Right.
professionals that you roll off the bench, and it's not like a program like Alabama where you can just roll another 5-star, sophomore off the bench. And so for, teams outside of that top 10, I think injuries are the difference between, it could be the difference between a 9-3 season and a 5-7 season. I really believe that. So I think that's valid. And so what Tucker had mentioned is that they had changed some things in the off season, and we saw some of those things in the spring game of how they were trying to minimize impact and injury. And one of the things he mentioned is they've done some studies that they don't want players to stay on the ground. They want them to get up off the ground quickly. Um, and I think JD also mentioned that he saw some significant changes in the way they approach things. And he kind of lauded the coaching staff to say that they're very proactive as far as when they see something, they change it immediately if they sense that there's a problem. Now, the part that I haven't mentioned before in any of this is that I feel like Tucker said almost the same thing a year or two ago, and so that I need to go back and check some of those quotes, and so
Mm-hmm.
that troubles me a little bit because it's like, well, is this really different? Um, but I will say that JD definitely mentioned that they're looking forward to going into the season actually having it feeling like week one as opposed to week eight, which is what
Yeah.
he, said last year, that they were so banged up on the offensive line that, it was hard to get traction. So, I mean, again, we'll see what happens this fall, but they're saying all the right things at this point of the year, which I guess is not surprising.
Yeah. Well, I mean, good that they're saying it. Obviously, we will see. Um, that was an interesting point of last season to me, though. Like, um, how obviously some of those things are unavoidable. They're just going to happen.
Yeah.
Um, but how so many of them happen so early. Um, I don't know the process of like strength and athletic training and all of those things, nutrition, all of that goes into it.
Mhm.
Obviously it's way more complex than I have any understanding of, but it's very interesting that that happened. But I do like, because that was something that was on my mind, like how do these things keep happening? And I didn't have any understanding. If we have a staff, like we do, I wonder how they didn't meet those or get those problems handled or meet those problems, at practice or where things were happening more. So that's interesting to me. That was something that I was wondering about and hoping to see less of next season. So fingers crossed on that.
Yes,
Um,
definitely.
yeah. Okay. Next point.
Mhm.
The kind of controversial game at Ford Field. What were Tucker's comments about that?
Well, Tucker just mentioned that briefly. This was asked to him a little bit later in the press conference, and he just said that it was a good opportunity, and he was very, very excited for it. And then actually, JD Plain was asked about that later, and he was all for it. He was very excited. He said that it's like a once in a lifetime opportunity, and
Yeah.
he was psyched. He had nothing but positive things to say, because we even mentioned that that's potentially losing your senior day, right? Because like
Mm.
that's the last game of the season, and so they'll have to push up some of those festivities. But no, he mentioned that it's going to be a primetime game. It's going to be the day after the Lions play on Thanksgiving, and playing in an NFL stadium is a dream that he's had. So like, yeah, it was nothing but positive from the players and coaches
Yeah.
about moving that game to Ford Field. As you mentioned, the fans that may live on the western side of the state, clearly it
Yeah.
stinks, and that's true. But I think there's a
Valid.
lot of
Yeah.
positives too.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, being someone that my family has season tickets, and so, we'd be out there in our parkas and, whatever on the coldest game, but
Mhm.
I kind of like that it's inside. I don't know. Obviously, the ticket situation was a little bit crazy, and I
Yeah.
get the whole controversy with that, but I kind of like it. Like you said, it's exciting and new and
Yeah.
different, and, you know, I don't have any problem with it, but I obviously understand the points of view that kind of were like
Yeah.
about the ticket thing. Oh well.
Yeah, I can see it both ways, and I
Yes,
think I
definitely.
signed up to try to. I might cover that game in person for Spartans Illustrated, so I'm excited about that. I put my name in the hat for that, so we'll
Okay,
see.
good deal. Okay, you touched on that you listened to JD kind of give his points, but I think
Mhm.
it was Tucker that maybe gave some more updates on some different players and kind of the competitions that have been happening. Do you have some points on that?
Yeah, yeah. There was actually, there was quite a bit of discussion of some players at the different levels, and I think the one on everyone's mind is the quarterback competition. And I think, first of all, I will say that I think any player that was asked about Thorne, they said kind of what you would expect, which is that, they fully support him. They still talk to him. They're still friends. He had to make the decision that he felt was in his best interest. And that was
Hmm.
really, we heard that refrain repeated several times. As far as the quarterbacks currently on the roster, Tucker did specifically talk about Noah Kim in his openings in the morning session.
Okay.
Now, I wouldn't read too much into that because he was asked specifically about Noah Kim.
Mm.
So of course that was all he commented on, but he didn't bring up the other two quarterbacks at all. Now that said, later in the day there was a lot more discussion about the other two quarterbacks on the roster, Sam Levitt being the incoming freshman, and the other guy whose name is escaping me right now, which I feel very bad about. Um, but there are of course three quarterbacks in the competition, and my understanding is that Mel Tucker said very specifically that it's a three quarterback race. I think everyone was assuming Kate Hauser, that's the other one. Thank you.
Yeah.
That it was a three that I think most people assume, and they're probably right. Let's be honest, that it's a between Kate Hauser and Noah Kim. But Tucker apparently said no, it's a three quarterback race. And so Sam Levitt being an incoming freshman
Interesting.
who I don't even know if he's on campus yet. I forget if he
Yeah, I'm not
enrolled
sure.
early or not. But at least some of the players have had some exposure to him because Trey Mosley was quoted as saying that basically Sam Levitt is a very confident quarterback, and that he really liked that about him. So we'll see what happens. And we've heard that Hauser has also picked up the playbook very quickly. So it could. I think there will be a real competition in the fall. I just expect Kim to win it, just because
Yeah.
he has a significant advantage in experience. So he's going to know the system. He knows the players. It's just kind of logical that unless one of the other two guys is just significantly more talented, which I think that, I mean, you could argue that maybe one or the other, maybe I can't really judge that, but I think the gap would have to be pretty high to make up for that difference in experience, and I don't think there is that big of a talent gap. So I fully expect Kim to win the job. Um, Now, when the bullets start flying, things get weird, and so you never know what might happen. I mean, I think the classic example that I've used before is that Connor Cook was kind of competing with Andrew Maxwell back in I guess it's like 10 years ago now, which I don't want to think about. But, the rumor around the street was that Maxwell was the better practice quarterback consistently, but Cook was just better in games. He was a gamer, and the rest is history. So, I mean, we have a situation like that this fall? It's certainly possible, but at this point, I would definitely assume that Kim would win the job. And I will mention that when Duplain was asked about the quarterbacks, Kim was the first player out of his mouth. So, I think I tend to read some out of that. So we'll see what happens. As far as other
Hmm.
playing groups, I know that Ryan had talked to Trey Mosley about the wide receiver position. There was some discussion of whether Mosley was going to play in the slot, which he primarily did, or
Hmm.
move to the outside. It sounds like he's repped at both, so we might see him in both places. As far as other wide receivers, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that Montori Foster and Christian Fitzpatrick are kind of the next two of the sort of core three-player group. And you can also read into this, but apparently those three receivers spent some time with Noah Kim in Virginia, in Noah's hometown, over the summer. So they all got some playing time together. You can kind of read into that what that might mean. But I think those are, that would be the expected players that that would see the field first, and you might have some younger players sprinkled in there as well. As far as other players, I know JD Duplain. We really tried to dig information out of him as far as like, well, what young players are you impressed with? And I got to say, he is a very sweet, charming young man. Like, he was
Hmm.
really fun to talk to, and he just seemed like a really, really nice kid. But he wouldn't really single out any player. He'd be like, yeah, I gotta, they're all my guys, and I can't just single out one of them. Um, so you have to kind of read the tea leaves about what he said. And one name, we'll give you one name on the offensive line. He mentioned Ethan Boyd, and which I believe
Okay.
is a redshirt sophomore now.
Hmm.
His name came up as a kind of an up and coming uh, rising player on the offensive line. So I think we may see some things out of him. I mean, I think the starting five is pretty well established because, I mean, if you look back into the number of snaps, there's five guys that took the vast majority of the snaps last year, and so um, I think that'll be very clear. But I do expect there to be a 7, 8 guy rotation at the offensive line, and it sounds like Boyd is in good shape. But then we also asked about the defensive side of the ball. We asked him, well, like, who's the toughest to block or whatever, and again, he didn't want to say anything. He listed everybody basically, but he did mention Simeon Barrow. He was the first name that came to mind.
Hmm.
And then he also um, mentioned the Colorado transfer. I believe his name's Sammy, who is a very
Hmm.
large individual. He comes in as a 6-year grad transfer from Colorado, and he's over 300 pounds. So his name came up a bit as a name to watch as well. Um, and Tucker also in his comments at the podium mentioned the front seven would be greatly improved, and how there's a large influx of talent at the defensive line position especially. So there's a lot of new faces there, and I think we will see potentially a talent upgrade there, and hopefully a health upgrade. That's always nice. At least there's more depth.
Yeah. Yeah. The depth thing is huge, I think. I don't know
Definitely.
if it is or not. It seems huge compared to what we had last year. So it's
Yeah.
nice that they are able to pull names of those younger players up when they're asked those questions. Because I think, like you said, you kind of can read into those answers a little bit, and that means something. So depth is
Mhm.
huge. And I like that that's a theme this year.
Yeah.
Any other overarching comments from your time in Indianapolis?
The only other point that I'll make is that there was some discussion about Darius Snow at the linebacker position. Of course, he went out very early in that
Mm-hmm.
first game of the season in the Western Michigan game. I think in the first half, maybe even the first defensive series, it was very, very early that he went down. And there was a lot of rumor at the time that it could be a career-ending injury. Um, and I think we saw him in a few of the games at Breslin. He was kind of seen around the mezzanine. Like I think I kind of saw him walking around Breslin, and I think he had a knee brace on, and it was actually a little bit hobbled, quite honestly. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and Tucker was asked about him, and he gave a very evasive answer, which is a very Tucker thing to do. He doesn't really like to
Mm-hmm.
comment on injuries. But I know David Harns actually pulled some. Was talking to some people a little bit off the record, and the general statement was that we don't expect Snow to be ready for the early games. Maybe he'll be ready by midseason. I think he tweeted out some videos of him in the rehab process, but he's not back fully to 100% yet, which I think is really really sad because that kid has
Yeah.
tremendous potential, really good, nice kid to talk to. And you just want to see him be able to complete his career healthy, and
Mm-hmm.
that's just really sad, I think.
Yeah, it was very sad when he went out because, like you said, it was so early, and then he was just gone the rest of the time, and you never want that for anyone, especially someone who's a name around the program for a little while, and like, yeah, just sad.
Yeah.
So hopefully, fingers crossed for mid-season. If he's already
Mhm.
kind of in that rehab process, hopefully that can continue and he can get back out there.
Yeah, I hope so.
Like I said, I'm super jealous that you were in Indianapolis. Maybe someday Ryan and David will let me go there. Um, I think the points that you made kind of about the different coaches and kind of what Mel Tucker said about the Northwestern situation um, is good, and I'm glad that they asked those questions because I think it's something that every program should kind of take a look at based off what we've
Mhm.
heard about the situation over there. So it's nice that they kind of addressed that, and Mel was able to kind of pivot it into kind of some other good things that the program is doing with the team and kind of leading into the season. Next, I want to talk about a recent article that you put out, kind of doing a deep dive analysis into MSU's upcoming football schedule. Um, some really good and interesting points and a different take on preseason articles that we kind of put out. So I want to highlight it. You did a schedule overview and you pulled a couple points. Talk to me about what you saw as you looked at the strength of schedule and kind of give me your analysis of that portion.
Sure. Well, I'll preface this by just giving a little bit of background on kind of how
Sure.
I do this.
Yeah,
I think that might make sense to lead people in.
sure.
And this is kind of an annual thing that I've done. One thing we've spoken about last spring is that I do a lot of analytics involving college basketball, and I apply some very similar philosophies here. For football, I've actually developed my own set of power rankings, which then I can use those to basically predict point spreads for the whole season. And if you can predict point spreads, you can assign probabilities, and then you can do all sorts of fun simulations. And so for basketball, I use Ken Palm, but for football, I use my own system basically. But the tricky part is that in the preseason, there's no data. Like we don't know, none of these teams have played. We don't really know how good they are.
Right.
So the only thing you can do is sort of pull from preseason publications or websites that rank all of the teams. And so what I look for every season is, anybody that'll rank the teams from 1 to now 133 Division 1 teams. There's two new ones this year. And so I kind of usually that data is available around July 1st. And so I start to, I literally go to a Barnes and Noble near my home and buy like the Phil Steele magazine, and I'll like look
Mm,
through the Athlons and the Lindy's, and those are kind of the three main publications. And like ESPN's FPI usually does a poll, and SP Plus from Bill Connolly is a good source, and Pro Football Focus. So I pull from these different sources, and I make like a consensus ranking. and then I use that to then say, okay, if these are the rankings, and then I can sort of project point spreads and so on. And so I did that for all 133 teams, and I plug in everybody's schedule, and then I run simulations, and then you can pull all of this information from there. And so kind of the first thing to note is where do the experts have Michigan State this year? And so I'm managing my screens here just a little bit, so I apologize for that. But basically, Michigan State, there's a little bit of disagreement as far as exactly how good the Spartans are going to be this year. Basically, they come in either somewhere between the 30s and the 60s nationally. Somewhat ironically, maybe ESPN's FBI actually had them ranked the highest at number 31. Which seems maybe a little bit generous. Most of the other publications had them between like 45, and Phil Steele actually had them the lowest at 66. Now, the bad news there is that Phil Steele is generally the most accurate of the preseason prognosticators. He advertises that, and I have found that in general he's correct, but honestly, he's not correct by a lot. Like if you look at the different magazines, they all basically tell you different versions of the same thing. So, he's technically correct, but maybe it doesn't actually matter. So if you bought the Athlon's preview, it's fine. But basically the average, when I average all these together, MSU graded in at about number 48. So that's kind of where we're sitting. We're not really borderline top 25. We're kind of like a step below that. So that's kind of the first piece of information. And then when you start looking at the teams on MSU's schedule this year, of course, we play 13 or 12 regular season games. The first thing you notice is that MSU's got a very, very difficult schedule. I run some various math on that, and I have MSU's overall schedule is number 6 nationally, as sixth most difficult, and number 1 in the Big Ten. Both, and I think MSU actually has both the most difficult overall schedule as well as the most difficult conference schedule, which is not ideal when you're coming off of a 5-win season. And if you look at the rankings of the teams on the schedule, you'll kind of see why. Because Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State are all consensus top 10 teams, so they are ranked in the top 10 of every source that I saw. And then Washington is at least in the top 20 everywhere. And in some cases, they're in the top 10. Like Athlon's and Lindy's has them in the top 10. Phil Steele and ESPN have them outside of the top 10. So that's not ideal. And then you have Iowa and Minnesota are both kind of borderline top 25 teams. There's Minnesota, or I'm sorry, I just mentioned Minnesota. There's too many M's. Maryland and Nebraska. Maryland and Nebraska are also in the 40s or 50s. So, they're kind of in Michigan State's peer group.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have Indiana and Rutgers. They're generally considered below Michigan State in the general hierarchy. And then finally you have Central Michigan and the Richmond Spiders from the FCF that MSU will play in week 2. So that kind of gives you a feel for the tiers that we're dealing with here. And so then you can break that down a little bit differently. You can say, okay, well, what does that actually mean, as far as the likelihood that MSU will win some of these games? And so for those borderline top 10 teams, or the ones that are in the top 10, basically that translates into saying that MSU is going to be a double-digit underdog in all of those games. 2 of those games are at home, Washington and Michigan. We're seeing preliminary spreads around 10 points, between 10 and 15 points for those games. My math sort of agrees with what you'll see on like an online casino right now. A lot of those, there is preliminary spreads on those games now. Of course, the game at Ohio State is that projected spread is plus 24 is what I see, so that's not ideal. Yeah, not great. And then the game at Ford Field against Penn State looks to be about a plus 15 right now is what my math says, and I think that's consistent with what we see online. So that's tough. 4 of your 12 games are double-digit underdogs, so your odds of winning those are pretty small. And then the next 2 hardest games are at Iowa and at Minnesota. So those 2 borderline top 25 teams play on the road. Not great.
Yeah.
So when you go through the math there, there's no better than a 30% chance to win any of those games. And that's half the schedule. Again,
Scary.
that's not good. So, you're already starting at kind of a scary situation. So then you look at the other 6 games. Now, the good news is that it looks like, based on the numbers I've crunched, that Michigan State should be favored in each of those 6 games. Okay, that's good. So 6 games you project to be favored, 6 games you project to be underdogs. Okay. But the problem is that for the games you're favored, the point spread looks like it's going to be a little tighter. And
Mm-hmm.
again, there's some subtle tricks to the schedule that make this kind of a little bit nasty, because there's the game, basically Maryland and Nebraska you both get at home, but Maryland and Nebraska are more similar to Michigan. They're more in Michigan State's peer group, and so those could be basically kind of
Mm-hmm.
toss up games. And
Yep.
so the
Tighter.
good,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they're most likely going to be tighter. Now, granted, MSU's at home, so hopefully that could put them over the edge, hopefully, but that's a little scary. And then the next 2 toughest games are at Rutgers, at Indiana. Well, those teams are weaker, but they're also on the road, so it sort of all evens
Mm.
out. So those 4 games look pretty similar, and so the spread that I'm seeing there is between 1 and 5 points for each of those. So those are all going to be they're a little bit better than a toss up, but they're like 60% chance that MSU is going to win any of those. So that doesn't quite offset for the other games that are going to be much much harder, basically. And then you get down to the 2 other games on the schedule, which are the ones against Richmond and Central. Those games at MSU will be heavily favored and over 10 points. But you know let's also think about the chances of playing Central Michigan. Like, MSU
Right.
has a little bit of scary history with the Chippewas. Chippewas have gotten us at least twice at home in the last 20 years.
Mm.
So um, so that makes you wonder. Like, that first game is going to be, the spread is, I think I've seen around 14, which is a little tighter than it should be. So, there's still I think about an 85% chance MSU wins that, but that's like rolling the dice and praying you don't get a 1. If you get a 1, it could be real bad.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the broad strokes overview of that. And then the sort of final piece of the puzzle is that when you look at this entire schedule together, the question is then, well, what does that mean as far as wins and losses? So probably, if anyone's bothered to look this up, the over under for wins for Michigan State schedule is about 5.5 is what you'll see online. So a little below 6, that's not ideal. And if I go through the math, that's essentially almost exactly what I calculate. I
Mm.
can, if you basically add up all the probabilities that I get, that gives you the expected number of wins. And I get, right on, basically right at 5.5. It's like 5.3 or something like that. And sort of based on the description I just gave, you can kind of understand why. Because you just say MSU's favored in 6, they're going to be underdogs in 6, but the ones that they're going to be the underdogs they're going to be much bigger underdogs than they will be in those favored games. So I think that the expected number of wins being a little below 6 makes sense. Now, the other way to look at that is, well, sort of what can go wrong or what can go right. And one of the kind of unique parts of the way that I look at this and the way I run my simulations is I take into account, the uncertainty in these numbers. And I think this is an underappreciated point. And so I actually, 2 of my earlier articles, this is a sort of a preseason series that I do, and it's going to have like 7 or 8 parts. So buckle up, Spartan fans. But the first 2 parts, I actually go back and look at some of the historical data where it says, okay, you see these preseason rankings, but like, how accurate are they really? And
Right.
the answer is, on average, they're pretty accurate, but there's a lot of variation. And, over having looked at over 10 years of data, it's usually plus or minus about 25 slots. So when you see a team like Michigan State coming in around 45, well, that could be plus or minus 25 within a standard deviation. So, if things go well, they could be a borderline top 25 team. That would be very reasonable. But if things don't go well, they could be in the bottom half of the country. So And that is a very big unknown, and that applies to everybody. It applies to the entire schedule, because some of the other calculations that I've done suggest that teams are the usual variance in a team's win total is about plus or minus 2 games. So if MSU's over under is 5.5, well, it could be if things trend in a positive direction, it could be up to 7.5. It could go down, but it could go down to 3.5, and you could easily imagine how that might happen. Um, but the biggest uncertainty is how good these teams really are,
Hmm.
and you know and we just don't know. Like probably the top five is probably pretty good,
Yeah.
but there's going to be 2 or 3 teams in that top 10 right now that won't be nearly as good as we think. The example last year was Oklahoma, who I think in my preseason analysis I picked Oklahoma to make the championship game, and I think they finished at like 7-5.
Mm.
So you know it doesn't always work out. And
It
like
happens.
TCU, they started the season ranked roughly where MSU is this year. So I'm not saying that MSU is going to have a TCU like season, but you know, teams do overachieve. It happens. So will that happen to Michigan State? I don't know.
That's going to be my title. Is MSU the new TCU?
Probably not. It's hard.
Something that I liked from your article, because I was feeling a little bit like, oh, I don't know, after kind of reading everything that you had put out from those different points, you said, and then this was just a good positive pull at the end. If Michigan State is better than expected, and if a few of the Spartans' opponents wind up being worse than expected, MSU could see a rebound like the one in 2021. I think right after that, you went on to say, or like the other way around, but
Yes.
I just kind of like X'd that out and pretended I didn't read it. And I like that point. This is preseason data. We have to remember. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to stay on the side of a couple of them are going to be worse than we think, and Michigan State is going to be better than kind of where they're standing right now. That's for my own mental health leading into the season, so we'll just go with that. But I thought that was a good positive point at the end of your article. I appreciated that.
I try to keep things balanced as far as the optimism and pessimism. Because yes, I mean,
Of course.
in that the TCU example is the roadmap to follow, where that team just wound up being way better than expected. Now there is also
Hmm.
the presence of luck, and luck. I actually
Right.
mathematically defined luck, which is dubious, but luck is basically the ability to win close games. And if every game on your schedule is a toss up, you know, odds are you'll win 6, but lucky teams win 7 or 8.
Yeah, right.
Um, Less lucky teams win 4 or 5. So if MSU is lucky, and they did have a little luck the last 2 years, well, no, last year luck was neutral, but 2 years ago, in
Mm.
the Peach Bowl year, MSU they
Of
overachieved a little
course.
bit. They won a lot of close games, so that could happen this year. The schedule impact often tends to be smaller. Like that's usually only plus or minus a game or two, but MSU could use a little luck on the schedule as well. Because yeah, if MSU is better than we think, and if teams like Minnesota or Iowa or Michigan, just to throw some names out there, if
Hmm.
they're
Hmm.
real bad for some reason, and they could be randomly bad, then that would help. So
Right.
that obviously would shift those numbers higher. But as I say, there's also a nightmare scenario out there where MSU can't compete with the teams that are in the top 10, and those 10 point spreads are double digit losses, and then the home games against Maryland and Nebraska are toss ups, and you get unlucky, and then you got to play teams like Indiana and Rutgers on the road that are both not very good, but they're still on the road. That could go very badly. So then you could start looking at something like the 2016 season, and we don't want to think about that anymore. So let's not
Mm,
talk about that anymore. That
no.
was that was bad. No one enjoyed that.
Yeah, no. Please stop. Yeah. Any other overarching points? And I know you said you have some other articles that'll be coming out in this
Yep.
series. So maybe, you'll be touching on some more things going forward. But anything kind of overarching that you found in this series overall that you want to touch on?
Yeah. Well, I think it's expect the unexpected. I think one thing
Hmm.
that I've found is everybody likes it's sort of like when we did the NCAA tournament preview, and it's like,
Yeah.
all the pundits want to say that there's going to be like 3 1 seeds and a 2 seed in the Final Four, and that literally never happens.
Right.
Well, no, it happened once. It did happen once, but it's probably not going to happen. So,
Hmm.
there's going to be some surprises. I don't think we can predict how things will go, but I will give you a little bit of a preview of my next article, which should be on the Big Ten race.
Okay.
Um, and I've crunched those numbers. I haven't started the write up yet, but a lot of people are projecting MSU to finish fifth in the Big Ten East, and that's consistent with what I see, because again, you got those three teams at the top: Michigan,
Hmm.
Penn State, and Ohio State. Those are all very good. Maryland is basically similar in quality to Michigan State as we know now. Maryland's got an easier schedule, so
Yeah.
it's pretty natural to expect that they might finish ahead. That's very reasonable based on what we know now. But I think that race for the Big Ten East lead could be interesting, because I think there's certainly a scenario where all three of those teams at the top are very good, and they kind of beat everybody else and then just lose in a round robin to each other.
Hmm.
So you could have a weird situation where you have 3 7-1 teams. And I think in that case, the tiebreakers get weird, but like Ohio State has the toughest schedule of those three. And I kind of think that might be the tiebreaker in that scenario, in which case Ohio State would have a slight edge.
Okay.
Um, Now, the other interesting scenario is that because Ohio State has such a tough schedule, like I think they go at Wisconsin, they could potentially lose an extra game, in which case then
Mm.
you'd have Michigan and Penn State tied with one loss. But the way the schedule works, Michigan travels to Penn State, so that would be the game you'd expect them to lose. Like you'd expect
Yeah.
Michigan to maybe beat Ohio State because they're at home, but lose to Penn State on the road, if those teams are all
Right.
roughly the same, you know.
Yeah.
So in that scenario, Penn State wins the East.
Hmm.
But then Michigan could still be good enough to make the playoffs. That's, in that scenario, I think that's what would happen. But I kind of have, for that reason, Penn State is my sleeper team in the East. I think
Okay.
I'm going to pick them. Like, I don't know if that's my official pick, because I usually lean a little heavier on the math, but like my kind of unofficial pick is Penn State to win the East. And then out west, there's a lot of, Wisconsin is kind of the clear favorite. They're the highest
Hmm.
ranked, and they have, I believe, the easiest Big Ten schedule based on my calculations. So a lot of people are picking Wisconsin. I think there's a big Luke Fickle optimism in Madison.
Yeah.
I'm not on the Luke Fickle train. I gotta believe it when I
Oh.
see it. He's yeah, I'm not. Like the thing people forget is that he was actually head coach for Ohio State for a season, like after the Jim Tressel
Hmm.
era came to an end, and it didn't go well at all. Like, granted, he was much younger then, but I don't know. I'm not going to pick Wisconsin to win the West. I don't think they're going to win it. I really don't.
Okay.
And I can't mathematically justify that, but I think we're going to see one of those other teams. The next tier down is like Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, and I think we'll see one of those teams in the Big Ten championship game this year. And my dark horse is Illinois. I like
Okay.
Brett Bielema. I don't like Brett Bielema, but I like Brett Bielema. He's a good coach. Got some other interesting baggage, but I'm real impressed with what he's done in Champaign so far, and I'm gonna pick him. So I like
Okay.
Penn State, Illinois in the Big Ten championship game. You heard it here, folks.
Okay. I kind of like that. Something different,
I'm
maybe.
different, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the pod. And maybe as you put out some other one of those articles in the preseason coming forward, you can come back on and kind of give
sure.
some more points about some different things that'll be coming up in our football season, which is coming very soon, and I'm very excited about it. Um, Subscribe to Spartans Illustrated to read more of our articles, Paul's articles, lots of stuff about Big Ten Media Day, and as we lead into football season, even more coverage of Spartan football. This podcast will be available on YouTube and anywhere that you listen, Spotify, Apple Music, and other places. And subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're at it, too. Might as well just subscribe to everything at once, just a couple clicks. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you all again soon. Bye.
All right. Bye, everyone.